All right, now let's go to the next part where we are going to build the settings. Okay, or so again, the next part, well, once we are done with logging config, now let's go to settings.py. Okay, and see what we're going to do in settings.py. First and foremost, what is this? You can call this as a single source file for your configuration. Okay, single source file for all the configuration of your pipeline. Okay, here basically every environment variable that we have, that we're going to define here. Okay, but we also need to understand what problem is this file exactly solving. Okay, see, the thing is, without centralized settings, okay, without, what we're doing is called as centralized settings. Okay, now without centralized settings, let's say there are multiple developers. Okay, and all your developers are using os.getEnv. Okay, and let's say this os.getEnv is, let's say, scattered. Okay, and that too across, let's say, 30 py files, or 30 files, not py files per se, but 30 files. And now you have to basically, now let's say, if the variable name in your environment variable changes. Okay, for example, I'll just write it here. For example, okay, if the environment variable name changes, okay, then it will cause a lot of issue. Okay, because now you have to go and hunt wherever you have defined that variable name across 30 files and change it, and that is going to be a very painful process. Okay, so here what we are going to do is we are just going to basically going to define everything in one shot. We're going to use pedantic settings. Okay, pedantic settings means, again, let me write it here. What we are trying to do is we're going to define pedantic settings, means all your environment variables are just defined in one place, and that one place is nothing but your settings.py file. As simple as that. Okay, yeah, so now let's say if your OpenAI API key is missing, okay, for that matter. So now in this case, I'm going to get a clear message that, hey, you know what, when the app starts, okay, I am going to get a clear error immediately, right? And not when my first LLM call fires. Okay, and this is also, basically the fail fast technique, right? So let's build it. Okay, all right. So let me just say from pedantic settings import, I'll just say base settings. Okay, and import it's called settings config dictionary, if I'm not wrong, right? We'll see. In case if we get an error, we'll just resolve it. Okay, now see, for example, what is base settings here? Base settings is basically pedantic's special base class for settings. Okay, it knows how to read values from environment variables. Okay, so I'll just call it here, and I'll just say it knows how to read values, okay, from environment variables, okay, and your .env files basically. Okay, and .env files. Okay, now the thing is, your regular pedantic base model, right, it reads from the Python dictionaries, which is the base settings. Okay, and sorry, which is read from the Python dictionaries, and your base settings is going to read from the environment, and that is the key difference. Okay, so and then you have the settings config dictionary. Okay, so what is the settings config dictionary? Settings config dictionary is basically how we configure the base settings behavior. Okay, how we configure the base settings behavior. Okay, which means where to find the .env file, what coding to use, etc, etc. Okay, all right, then I'm going to just say from pedantic import field. Okay, from pedantic import field. Okay, and what does field do? Field basically adds the metadata. Field adds what? It adds the metadata. Okay, and rather metadata I would say to each setting. Okay, we'll see this, you know, as we start defining the variables. Okay, let us start with defining the class, and this inherits from base settings. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to define all the configurations at one place. Okay, so all configs defined in one place only. Okay, cool. So now the field names here that we're going to define, okay, they map directly to the env variable names. Okay, and please try to understand they are case insensitive. Okay, let me write it here. They are what? They are case insensitive. Okay, so even if you define OpenAI API key like this, okay, this is equal to how you have defined in your .env variable. All right, cool. So let us start with defining the model config. I'll just call the settings config dictionary. Okay, and in here I'll just say env file is which one? It's your .env. So this is your environment file. Okay, and this is going to basically tell the pedantic to read from the .env variables. All right, as simple as that. Yeah. Then I'm just going to say env file encoding, and I'm going to set it to UTF-8. Okay, and this is the standard text encoding for your .env files. It ensures that special characters in your passwords or anything, they are read correctly. Okay, then it will ask me if the case sensitive is equal to false. Okay, I'll just say case sensitive equals to false. We've already defined this. And then I'll also say extra equals to, I'll just set this to ignore. Okay, for example, let's say your .env variable, okay, has already, sorry, your .env file has variables that we have not defined here. Okay, here as in that particular code file, we are just going to ignore them. Okay, and without this, the pedantic raises an error. Okay, now please try to understand, when you will be getting all these codes, these all codes will be documented very well. So for every single line you will be having explanation what it does. As of now, just for explanation purposes, I'm writing and then explaining. Cool. All right, after this, what do we define? We are going to define the OpenAI API key, which is going to be of string, and then I'm going to use the field parameter here. Okay, and okay, something is off here. Oh yeah, this should just end here, right? I should not be defining it here. Sorry for that. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the OpenAI API key, which is going to be string, and now I'm going to define field. Okay, what does field do? It adds metadata. In field, I'm going to add 3 dots, comma. Now, what does these 3 dots mean? This 3 dot means that the OpenAPI key is required. Okay, as I said, this is pedantic language. Okay, 3 dots when I define a field or define a variable, and then in the field parameter I define 3 dot, it means that this defining this is compulsory, as simple as that. Okay, if in case this OpenAI API key is not there in my .env file, it is going to raise the error. Like specifically, it is going to raise validation error. Okay, and now we give the description here. Okay, so description, I'm just going to say OpenAI API key, OpenAI API key for LLM and embeddings. This is how you define a simple field parameter, nothing else. Then I'm going to say OpenAI embedding model. Okay, which embedding model? So I'm just going to say field. Again, this is compulsory, so I'll put 3 dots. In fact, let us set it to default. So let us not put compulsory as such. I'll just say default to text embedding 3 large, which and by default it takes around 3072 dimensions. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll put the description as well, and description I'll just say OpenAI model used to generate the vector embeddings. Okay, I've defined the OpenAI model, then I need to define the chat model which I'm going to use. Okay, and the chat model which I'm going to use is I'm going to set it to default. Let's say I'm going to prefer GBD40, and then again I'm going to define the description. Okay, and I'll just say OpenAI model used for agent reasoning. So my agents will be using GBD40, as simple as that. Okay, now we're going to define LangSmith. LangSmith tracing we're going to do. So I'm just going to say LangSmith API key. Okay, I'm going to say it is going to be of string variable or string data type. Yeah, and field, I'm going to say that we need this, so it is compulsory. And then I'm going to put in a description. I'm going to say LangSmith API key for agent tracing. Okay, then I'm going to say LangSmith project. Okay, in LangSmith project I'm going to say default, and let's say I'm going to name it to whatever, let's say clinical trial intelligence. Okay, this is what I'm going to define the LangSmith project as, like it's the name, okay, under which we are going to trace it. And then I'm going to define the description. Okay, I'm going to say LangSmith project name. Okay, then I'm going to define LangSmith tracing v2. Because we want to trace the project, I'm going to set it to boolean. Okay, and we're going to set it to true basically, right? So let's say default we're going to set it to true. Okay, and I'm going to define the description as well, and in the description I'm going to say enable LangSmith tracing for all the agentic runs, for all the agent runs. Okay, then we're going to define the GCP credentials, which needs the project ID. Okay, so I'm going to say field, and then I'm going to say I'm going to put the default. Just a minute, there's no default here. We're going to say that we need the project ID, and then we're going to define the description, and the description is nothing but, let's say, GCP project ID. Okay, and then I'm going to define the region. Okay, so I'm just going to set it to str field, and then I'm going to set the default region to US Central 1. If you want to use anything else, you can do that. Okay, Central 1. And see, the thing is, US Central 1 is actually the cheapest and the most available GCP region. Okay, and that is the reason I'm using it. Okay, then I'm going to set my description. Okay, in description I'll just say GCP region for all the cloud resources. Okay, then I'm going to put in the GCS bucket name. Okay, in GCS bucket name I'm going to say field. Okay, and I'm going to say that bucket name is required, so I'm going to put in 3 dots, and then I'm going to put in the description as well. Okay, and in description I'm going to put Google Cloud Storage bucket name. Okay, then I need to define the database credentials, so I'll just say DB host. Okay, then I'm going to say string, and I'm going to put in field, and then I'm going to put in 3 dots, and then I'm going to define the description for DB host. I'm going to say Cloud SQL host IP. Okay, or the socket path. Okay, so you can, I'll just put in the bracket here, Cloud Run. What is this? We'll see this later. Okay, all right, then I'm going to define the DB port. Okay, in DB port I'm going to define the DB port, yeah, correct, DB port. I'm going to set the default port to 5432. Okay, see, 5432 is actually a standard PostgreSQL port, right? So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to set my description to PostgreSQL port. Okay, after DB port I'm going to put in the DB name. Okay, and I'm going to put the DB name here. Okay, let's say I'm going to put the DB name default to, let's say, clinical trial DB. Okay, or you can put in anything else, it's totally fine. Okay, and description, sorry, just a minute. Description, I'm going to say PostgreSQL database name. Okay, this is my DB name. Then I'm going to define the DB user. Okay, I'm going to define the field. Okay, DB user credentials are required. This is basically the database user that we have created. Okay, and we're going to create this with Google SQL. We'll see that Google G Cloud SQL users, we'll do that, all of that. Okay, then I'm going to say description. Okay, and in description I am going to put this is my PostgreSQL database user. Okay, and then I'm going to hit the no, I think this looks fine. Okay, DB user. After DB user we need to put the password as well. Okay, and then again I'm going to put in 3 dots, and then I'm going to put in the description, and the description is going to be PostgreSQL database password. So you can see all the credentials we're just passing in here itself. Okay, and then we need to pass the clinical trials base URL. Okay, now this is where we need to pass the the credentials, or the credentials of clinicaltrials.gov. See, clinicaltrials.gov is where we are going to extract our data from, right? So it's the source for us. Yeah, so first and foremost we're going to pass the base URL. Okay, and I'm going to set the default URL here. Okay, and I'm just going to say clinical it's what, clinicaltrials.gov/API/v2. This is the default base URL we're going to fetch it from. Okay, and then now this is the base URL. Okay, all right, and all the endpoints, okay, are calls, or rather all the endpoint calls are basically built from this base URL. Yeah, and then I'm going to define the description, and then in the description I'm just going to say clinicaltrials.gov API v2 base URL. Okay, looks good. And then I need to define the clinical trials page size. Clinical trials page size. Okay, I'm going to put into int. Okay, and then I'm going to define field, and I'm going to say 100. Okay, so, or rather it should be default 100. Why am I writing 100? Default 100. Okay, which means how many studies, or rather how many studies to request per API page. See, we want to fetch the research studies, right? So how many research studies do we want? Okay, or we want to request per API page. So we want 100 studies. Okay, maximum I think you can fetch up to 1000 studies or so, but I think 100 is kind of safer. If you want more, you can set it to 300, etc. We are setting it to 100 for rate limits and memory, right? Cool. All right, and then I am going to define the description here. Okay, which is number of studies. Okay, number of studies to fetch per API page. Looks good. All right, now I'm going to define that of PubMed, which is our second source from where we're going to fetch the data from, right? So I'll set it here. Okay, I'm going to firstly set the default, and this default URL is HTTPS. Yeah, it is this one only, if I'm not wrong, right? So yeah, this one only. Let me just give me a minute. Let me please check this. Yeah, this is fine. Okay, this looks good. Okay, and then I'm going to say description. Okay, and I'm going to set the description to PubMed eutils API base URL. All right, this looks good. Then we need to define the credentials with respect to our API server, right? So I'm going to define the API host. Okay, I'm going to say it as string field. Okay, I'm going to set the default to 0.0.0.0. Okay, then I'm going to define the description here. I'm just going to say fast API host address. Okay, fine, this looks good. Then I'm going to define the API port. Okay, this API port, again I'm going to set it to int. Okay, I'm going to set the default port to 8000. Okay, and after this I'm going to define the description, and description I'm just going to say fast API port. Okay, then I'm going to define the API underscore env. Okay, I'm going to define the field here. I'm going to define default equals to development. See, either it can be development or production, right? But as of now we are in the development phase, so I'm going to set it to development. Okay, yeah, looks good. All right, and I'm just going to put in the description as well. Description, I'm just going to say environment name, development or production. All right, looks good. Okay, and now we're going to define the computed properties. Okay, so now we're going to define or build the full async Postgres connection, okay, from parts. Okay, that is what we are going to build, right? So I'm going to just say, okay, I'm going to create this function called base URL. Okay, and all right, so what does this function do basically? This function basically builds the full async PostgreSQL connection string, okay, from parts. Okay, now we will be using async pg, okay, as the async PostgreSQL driver. All right, and see, the thing is, when it comes to my async pg, okay, firstly, why are we using async pg? Because we are looking at concurrency. Okay, if we have concurrent users tomorrow, the kind of code that we are writing using async, we will be able to handle them. Okay, so when it comes to async pg requires the connection string to start with somewhat like PostgreSQL plus async pg. This is how your async pg wants to start the connection string. Connection string is how you're connecting it to the PostgreSQL database. And what does it return? It basically returns a full connection URL, okay, which is ready for async pg, okay, dot create underscore pool. We'll see when we actually work with this. Okay, for example, it will look something like, it will start with this string, okay, and then it will look something like, you know, whatever the name of your database user is, then password, etc. For example, let's say the name of our DB is Mosaic, DB user is Mosaic user, and then password, okay, at the rate 3274.203, then the port number. Okay, this is how basically the URL will look like for your PostgreSQL connection. Okay, and what does it return? Right, what does it return? It, as we discussed, it returns the PostgreSQL plus async PG. Okay, which is your start of the connection string. Across along with this, it takes the DB user. DB user is this one that we have defined here. Okay, DB user followed by the password, right? DB underscore password. Then it will take what? It will take the DB host. Okay, along with that, it will take DB port. Just look here, right? See what we have defined here. We're just going to connect everything together. So PostgreSQL async PG, PostgreSQL async PG, DB user, DB user, DB password, DB password, at the rate DB host, DB host, DB port, DB port, and after DB port, what is remaining? The DB name. So let us add that as well. Okay, and followed by this, and then DB name. What is going to be the DB name? So we're just going to say self dot DB underscore name. Looks good. All right. Now guys, please note, you are trying to you're building actual production level code here. Okay, you're actually engineering an AI solution, so it will require you to learn new things, understand concepts. Okay, so that is what we are doing here. Okay, all right. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this function, and this function basically returns true if the app is running in production. As simple as that. Okay, and cool. So I'll just say here return self dot API underscore env dot lower. I'm going to set this to production. Production. Yeah, I think this looks fine. Fair. I think this looks good. Yeah, I thought so. The alignment issue. This alignment is fine. Okay, just give me a minute, please. Better. All right. Something is off, it seems. Just give me a minute, please. No, it's fine. Okay, all right. So we have defined here. Okay, and then I'm just going to say I'm going to define the singleton instance here. Okay, and I'm going to say settings equals to settings. We're just going to instantiate that here. Okay, all right, looks good. Cool, looks good. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create one instance of settings when this module is first imported, right? So now later we can just write it this way: from config.settings import settings. Okay, and then from here itself, you can start working. Now what you have done is your configuration is set up. Okay, now if you see from config.settings import settings, so when I import settings, I'll be reading all of the credentials, whether it is the database, PostgreSQL connection string to the API keys to the embedding model, everything I can directly read it from here. Okay, this is fantastic. All right, cool. Let's proceed with the next part.